The hum of the courthouse heater was still buzzing when I heard my son laugh at the lie he'd sworn against me. Still, I kept my hand steady on my cane, letting that low vibration settle my breath. As the hum deepened, it reminded me how long I'd stayed silent just to keep this family warm. While it echoed through the room, I finally understood who had been feeding off my quiet all these years. The same hum pressed against my ribs as I chose dignity over fear. That's when I knew the truth would be the only thing left standing. Before the story begins, tell me, where are you watching from? I hope your day's gentle and calm. Please like, subscribe, and let's start our story together. Walter Harris moved slowly through the wide glass doors of the Jefferson County Courthouse, the cold morning air still clinging to his coat as he stepped inside. The polished floor gleamed under the fluorescent lights, and every step he took echoed with a soft tap of his cane. He hated that sound. It made him feel older than his 67 years, older than he wanted anyone, especially his own children, to see. His hand trembled slightly on the handle as he scanned the lobby, unsure which courtroom he was supposed to enter, unsure of why any of this had to happen at all. He whispered a polite greeting to the security officer who recognized him, then followed the hallway signs until he reached Courtroom 2B. The door felt heavier than he expected when he pushed it open. The room was already half filled. Lawyers talked quietly, shuffling papers. A few people sat waiting for their cases to be called, all wearing the same drained expressions Walter had worn for weeks. He drew a slow breath and lifted his gaze toward the front of the room, toward the plaintiff's table, where his son and daughter-in-law sat like honored guests at a banquet neither of them deserved. Kyle and Brittany were leaned in close, whispering and laughing about something on her phone. Their shoulders touched, their heads nearly bumping together as if they shared some private joke at the world's expense. They looked too casual for a courtroom, too relaxed, too amused. Walter's stomach tightened. He had hoped, even after everything, that seeing him would spark some glimmer of recognition, some sense that he was still their father, still family. But instead, the moment their eyes lifted and landed on him, the transformation was instant. Kyle rolled his eyes first, the gesture sharp, dismissive, almost theatrical. Brittany followed with an even bigger one, her head tilting back as she exhaled dramatically like she was offended by the very sight of him. Then she leaned closer to Kyle and muttered loudly enough that half the room heard her. "Great, the old man made it." A couple of people glanced over. One woman frowned in sympathy toward Walter before looking away quickly. Walter felt the words hit him harder than the cold wind outside ever could. It wasn't just the insult. It was the ease with which she said it, as if he were a burden she'd been forced to carry rather than the man who had spent decades supporting the very son sitting beside her. He tried to straighten his back, but humiliation had a weight all its own. His shoulders curled inward without his permission. He lowered his gaze to the floor, trying to swallow the sting that burned the back of his throat. He still didn't understand how this had escalated into a lawsuit. He still didn't know what lie they planned to tell the judge today. All he knew was that his own son wanted him here, not for support, not for help, but as a defendant, as the problem. He shuffled toward the defense table, each step making him feel smaller. His already tight chest constricted as he sat down, the wooden chair cold through his coat. He set his cane carefully beside him and folded his trembling hands in his lap. Maybe there was a misunderstanding. Maybe something could still be salvaged. Some part of him, some fragile, naive part, clung to that hope even as the evidence of betrayal sat 12 feet away smirking at him. The bailiff's voice cut sharply through the room. "All rise." Walter pushed himself up with effort. The courtroom fell silent as Judge Marion Reed entered, a woman with presence carved from stone. Her dark robe swayed as she stepped toward the bench, her eyes scanning the room with precision. She didn't sit immediately. Instead, she paused, watching the parties before her with the trained instincts of someone who had witnessed decades of lies dressed up as truth. Her gaze swept over Kyle, over Brittany. She caught the remnants of their smirks, the posture, the self-satisfaction. Then her eyes landed on Walter, small, quiet, standing with more respect than strength, and her expression shifted almost imperceptibly. Something sharpened, something measured. When everyone was seated again, Judge Reed adjusted her glasses, still watching the two younger adults with a look that suggested she had already made her first assessment. And it wasn't in their favor. Walter didn't notice. His mind was too busy fighting through the fog of confusion and heartbreak. He sat carefully, his joints stiff, his breath uneven. He kept telling himself to stay calm, to trust that truth had a way of surviving even under pressure. But the ache inside him grew heavier with every passing second. He didn't know that Judge Reed was already studying the dynamic between them. He didn't know she had clocked the disrespect the moment she walked in. He didn't know that the tiny details, eye rolls, smirks, whispered jokes, had already begun shaping the tone of the case before a single word had been spoken. All Walter knew was this: his own son had looked at him with disgust, not love, and something inside him had cracked in a way he wasn't sure could ever fully mend. As the judge called the case and the attorneys prepared to speak, Walter folded his hands tightly, bracing himself, aware that whatever happened next would change his life, but still completely unaware just how deeply the coming hours would expose truths he had never wanted to believe. The memory still burned in Walter's mind, as sharp and unwelcome as the sting of winter air on his cheeks. It had started innocently, just a quiet Sunday afternoon, the kind where the house felt too big and too quiet since his wife passed. He'd been fixing a loose hinge on the kitchen cabinet when he heard a car door outside. Before he could stand fully, the front door swung open and Kyle and Brittany stepped inside like they owned the place. Brittany's perfume entered the house before she did, thick and sugary, clashing with the faint smell of wood oil and old memories. They didn't bother with small talk. Kyle sat at the table, tapping nervously on the wood, while Brittany paced with her arms crossed. Walter sensed the tension immediately, wiping his hands on a dish towel as he approached them. "We found the perfect house," Kyle announced, trying to sound upbeat. "It's bigger, newer, amazing schools, and we need you to co-sign the loan." Walter blinked, unsure he'd heard correctly. Co-signing meant responsibility, risk. His entire home, paid off after decades of double shifts, would be on the line. I'm not sure I can do that," he said, lowering himself into the chair across from them. "I'm on a pension now, son. If anything goes wrong, I could lose everything." Brittany stopped pacing. Her eyes narrowed with irritation so potent it broke through her perfect smile. "It's just paperwork, Walter. You're not actually paying anything. God, you make everything so difficult." Kyle shot her a look, but he didn't defend his father. Instead, he leaned forward, voice soft, almost rehearsed. "Dad, we need this. Why is it so hard for you to help us? You never support anything we do." Walter felt the accusation like a bruise forming under the skin. "Kyle, I've helped you plenty, but this could cost me my home." Brittany scoffed loudly. "It's not like you're doing anything with your home except sitting in it all day. You're being uselessly dramatic." The word useless slammed into him with a force he wasn't prepared for. He tried to keep his face steady, but the hurt showed anyway. Walter clasped his hands together, choosing gentleness even when cruelty would have been easier. "I'm sorry, truly, but I can't risk losing what your mother and I worked our whole lives for." Kyle pushed back his chair hard enough that it screeched across the floor. "So that's it. You'd rather watch us struggle than lift a finger to help." Walter's voice cracked. "I'm not choosing that at all." But Brittany was already done. She grabbed her purse, muttering, "Unbelievable," with venom dripping from every syllable. She stormed out, slamming the door behind her so hard the picture frames rattled on the wall. Kyle followed her, pausing only long enough to look over his shoulder at Walter with disappointment carved into his expression. "You always find a way to let me down." The door closed. Silence settled over the kitchen like dust. Later that evening, when the sun dipped low and painted the living room in soft orange, Emily showed up without warning. She stepped inside quietly, immediately noticing the tension in her father's posture. "Dad," she said gently, setting her purse down, "Kyle came to see me. He sounded upset. What happened?" Walter tried to shrug it off, tried to make it sound smaller than it felt. "They just wanted me to co-sign something. I told them I couldn't." Emily knelt beside his chair, her hand resting softly on his forearm. "And they didn't take it well, did they?" He swallowed hard. "No, they didn't." Her eyes filled with worry, not anger, not judgment, just a deep ache for the pain she knew he wouldn't voice. "Dad," Brittany pushes him, "you know that. Don't blame yourself." Walter forced a small smile, patting her hand. "It'll blow over. They were just frustrated." But Emily looked unconvinced. She stayed a while longer, making him tea. Talking about small things, trying to lighten the air. When she finally left, Walter stood at the doorway watching her taillights fade into the night. He clung to the hope he'd spoken aloud, that things would smooth out, that tomorrow would be better. He had no idea that the worst part hadn't even touched him yet. 3 days later, a thick envelope arrived in his mailbox. The return address, Harris and Lowell Legal Associates, made his stomach twist. Inside were pages and pages of printed accusations. According to the complaint, he had promised to provide financial support for Kyle and Brittany's new home. He was being sued for backing out. Walter stood in the middle of his living room, papers trembling in his hands, the words blurring as they sank in. They hadn't just been angry. They had been preparing for war. And now, he was being dragged into a courtroom he never imagined he'd have to enter, against the son he once carried on his shoulders. The floor felt unsteady beneath him, as he whispered the only question that mattered. How could my own child do this? Walter sat at the small oak dining table he'd sanded and refinished himself years ago, the same table where birthdays had been celebrated, homework battles had been fought, and Sunday dinners had once filled the room with laughter. Now it was buried beneath a stack of legal papers that looked more like a foreign language than anything meant for him. He picked up the top page again, the print crisp and unfriendly, and read the first paragraph for what felt like the 100th time. His eyes moved across the words, but every sentence struck him like a blow to the chest. Kyle Harris and Brittany Harris v. Walter Harris. Failure to provide agreed-upon financial assistance. Verbal commitment to fund down payment and mortgage support. He let the paper fall back to the table, rubbing the bridge of his nose as the room blurred for a moment. "Verbal agreement," he whispered to the empty kitchen. His voice cracked from disbelief. When did I ever say that?" His hands trembled as he sifted through more pages, each paragraph more shocking than the last. According to the complaint, Brittany alleged he had offered to contribute a substantial amount of money toward their new home, an offer she claimed he later backed out of maliciously. Kyle had added his own statements, accusing Walter of sabotaging their future, undermining their financial stability, and acting out of jealousy because the world had moved on without him. Walter felt his breath catch in his throat. Jealousy, malicious intent. Those words didn't just sting, they carved into him. He had spent decades trying to support Kyle through bad decisions, through job losses, through arguments with Brittany he pretended not to overhear. And now the son he'd carried on his shoulders was accusing him of trying to ruin his life. The kettle on the stove whistled sharply, snapping him out of the fog for just a moment. He stood, shut it off, and poured water into a mug just to give his shaking hands something to do. But even the tea tasted metallic, wrong. Nothing felt steady anymore. The front door opened without warning. "Dad," Emily called gently. She stepped into the kitchen and froze when she saw the papers spread out before him. Oh God, they actually filed it. Walter looked up and she saw the raw hurt in his eyes before he could mask it. She walked to him, placed a hand on his shoulder, and sat beside him. He didn't speak at first. He just slid the top page toward her. She read silently, her jaw tightening, then reread, her face flushing with anger he rarely saw in her. "This is lies," she said finally, pressing the page flat against the table. "Every line of this is twisted." Walter sank back in his chair. Maybe I explained myself poorly. Maybe Kyle thought. "No," Emily interrupted firmly. "You were clear. You said you couldn't co-sign. That is not the same as promising money." She paused, softening her tone. "Dad, this isn't a misunderstanding. This is intentional." He swallowed hard. "I never wanted it to come to this. I never wanted to fight my own children." Emily took a breath, steadying herself. "We need a lawyer now. This is serious." Walter hesitated. Hiring a lawyer felt like admitting something terrible, that this wasn't going to just blow over, that his own son had turned something inside out in a way that couldn't be undone. But Emily was right. He couldn't face this alone. They made calls for nearly an hour. Names, numbers, referrals. Finally, they got an appointment with attorney Vincent Price, a man known locally for being quiet, steady, and nearly impossible to shake in a courtroom. Emily drove Walter to the office the next morning, the sky gray with the threat of snow. Walter stared out the window the whole drive, wondering how the world could look so unchanged while his own life had split in half. Price's office was lined with casebooks and old wooden furniture that smelled faintly of tobacco. He greeted them with a calm nod, motioning for them to sit. Walter handed him the stack of documents with shaking hands. Price read silently, page by page, his expression unreadable but his eyes sharp. When he reached the end, he exhaled through his nose. "I've seen cases like this before," he said, tapping the papers lightly. "Manipulation dressed up as victimhood. She's clever, your daughter-in-law, strategic in all the wrong ways." Walter lowered his gaze. Hearing someone else acknowledge it made everything feel heavier. "I don't understand how they could write these things. Kyle, my own son." Price leaned forward. "Mr. Harris, this isn't about truth for them. This is about leverage. They believe you're vulnerable, that you'll fold rather than fight." He paused, softening just a fraction. "But you're not alone, and we're not losing this." Walter blinked, startled by the certainty in Price's voice. Emily squeezed his hand, her expression full of fierce support. Still, the shame crept in, cold and persistent. "Maybe I failed him," Walter whispered. "Maybe I was the father he needed." Price shook his head. "You didn't fail. They're exploiting your kindness, not your mistakes." Walter nodded slowly, breathing through the ache that lingered in his chest. Price gathered the documents into a tidy stack and set them aside with deliberate confidence. "Mr. Harris," he said, "from this moment on I handle the fire. You just stand your ground." And as Walter left the office, stepping into the turning wind of late afternoon, he felt something shift. Not relief, not strength yet, but the first flicker of resolve forming beneath the hurt. Because now the battle had begun. Walter sat across from attorney Vincent Price in the small conference room that overlooked the parking lot. Afternoon light slanted through the blinds in thin, sharp lines, cutting across the table where a yellow legal pad sat waiting. Price adjusted his glasses, clicked a pen, and leaned forward with the calm intensity of a surgeon preparing for a difficult operation. "All right, Walter," he began, his voice steady. "We need to go through every interaction you've had with Kyle and Brittany over the last few months. Every conversation about money, housing, promises, anything they might twist." Walter nodded, though part of him flinched at the thought of dissecting moments that already hurt enough the first time. Price's eyes stayed on him, patient yet purposeful, guiding without pressure. Slowly, haltingly at first, Walter started to talk. He described the visit when Kyle and Brittany first asked him to co-sign the loan, how Brittany's irritation had barely been hidden, how Kyle had guilted him by saying he never helped enough, how Brittany had muttered insults under her breath as she slammed the door. Price wrote quickly, noting key phrases, asking for clarification. His questions were precise. Did Kyle raise his voice? Did Brittany say he promised something? Did they send texts afterward? Did they ever give him documents to sign? Each question pulled another memory into the open, and with each one Walter felt both drained and strangely lighter, like exposing the truth was slowly unburdening him. Price leaned back after several minutes, tapping his pen. "This wasn't spontaneous," he said. "This was planned. You can see the pattern. They pushed, guilted, insulted, and when you didn't cave, they escalated." Walter hesitated, then exhaled. "It's always been like that, for years." Price's eyebrows lifted slightly. "Years." Walter looked down at his hands. "Kyle struggled after college, went through jobs quickly. I helped him, rent, car payments, even groceries for a while. I didn't keep track. I just wanted him to find his footing. Brittany would tell him I was holding him back, but he always came to me when things got tight." Price leaned forward again. "How much money are we talking, roughly?" Walter hesitated, embarrassed. "Tens of thousands, maybe more. I never kept a strict tally." That caught Price's full attention. He straightened, expression sharpening as if a door had suddenly opened. "Did you ever transfer funds electronically? Venmo, bank transfers, checks?" Walter nodded. Sometimes cash. I wrote checks when he needed bigger amounts." Price wrote with renewed energy. "Then there's a trail, and a trail works in our favor." For the first time, Walter felt a flicker of relief. Maybe all those late nights balancing bills to make room for Kyle's struggles would mean something now. Maybe they would prove who he had truly been in this family. Someone trying, someone giving, someone who deserved better than lawsuits and accusations. Price stood and walked to a filing cabinet, retrieving a list. "I'll need anything you can find. Old bank records, cashed checks, receipts, text messages where he asked for help. Anything documenting your support. The more we gather, the clearer the manipulation becomes." Walter nodded. Though he felt overwhelmed, his filing system consisted mostly of old shoeboxes and stacked folders tucked into closets. "I'll look," he said. "I just don't know how much I still have." Before Price could respond, there was a soft knock at the door. Emily stepped in, holding a large cardboard box in her arms. Her cheeks were flushed, either from the cold outside or from carrying something heavy. "I went through Dad's storage closet," she said breathlessly. "I thought these might help." She set the box on the table. Papers, envelopes, faded receipts, and old bank statements spilled out slightly. Walter's eyes widened in surprise. "Emily, where did you? I didn't think any of that was organized enough to be useful." She smiled softly. "Dad, you might forget where things are, but you never threw anything away. Mom used to say you kept every scrap of paper just in case. Guess today is that case." Price moved to the box, sifting through the contents quickly but carefully. It took less than 10 seconds for his expression to shift. He pulled out a stack of old check carbon copies, each one written to Kyle. Another stack of printouts showing electronic transfers. Receipts for car repairs Walter had covered. Rent payments he'd quietly filled in for. Grocery store gift cards. Dozens of small but undeniable acts of support spanning years. Price looked up, and for the first time since Walter had met him, the corner of his mouth lifted into a faint, satisfied smile. "Well," he said, eyes glinting, "it seems they picked the wrong man to underestimate." Walter exhaled slowly, the weight in his chest easing just a little. For the first time since the summons had arrived, he felt something other than fear. He felt the beginning of a fight. And as Price began organizing the documents into piles, preparing the opening moves of a case built on truth rather than manipulation, Walter sensed the turning of the tide, quiet, steady, unstoppable. The kind of shift that didn't announce itself with noise, only with certainty. "Now," Price said, gesturing to the growing stack of evidence, "let's make sure the judge sees exactly who you've been all along." Walter nodded, unaware that this discovery was only the first blow in a storm about to break wide open. The house was quiet that evening, the kind of quiet that felt heavy rather than peaceful. Walter sat in his recliner, a blanket draped over his lap, trying to distract himself with the TV, but nothing held his attention. Every few minutes, his mind drifted back to the courthouse, to Kyle's accusations, to Brittany's glare. His chest tightened each time he replayed their words. He kept telling himself to breathe, to stay calm, to trust Price. But doubt had a way of curling around him at night, tightening like a cold hand. His phone suddenly buzzed on the side table. At first, he didn't react. Unknown numbers had been calling more frequently since the lawsuit filed. When the buzzing stopped, he let out a breath, then it buzzed again. This time it wasn't a call. It was a notification. New voicemail. He frowned. He hadn't heard the phone ring. With a cautious swipe, he opened the message and pressed play. A sharp burst of static came first, then Brittany's voice dripping with venom. "Oh my God," she snapped, mid-conversation, clearly unaware the call had connected. "Did you hear him today? He sounded desperate, pathetic. Honestly, I'm shocked the old man can even walk into court without falling apart." Walter froze. Kyle's laugh echoed faintly in the background, an easy, thoughtless laugh. A sound Walter used to love, a sound that now cracked something deep inside him. Brittany kept talking, louder, crueler. "He's basically a walking wallet, Kyle. He always has been. He exists to be used. And trust me, the judge is going to eat our story up. He's clueless, gullible, and too soft to defend himself." Kyle chuckled again. Yeah, I know." The voicemail ended with Brittany adding a final, dismissive snort. "We're going to win this. Watch." Silence slammed down on the room. Walter's breath hitched. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, gripping the blanket to steady himself. The cruelty in her voice didn't just hurt, it hollowed him. It felt like the floor beneath him had given out, leaving nothing but disbelief and humiliation. His heartbeat thudded in his ears, faster than he could process. A walking wallet. Clueless. Exists to be used. He had heard insults before. Life wasn't kind and neither was grief. But hearing his son laugh at those insults, laugh at the idea of using him, shattered something that had survived even the worst years of his life. Unexpected tears blurred his vision. He pressed the heels of his hands to his eyes, trying to hold himself together, but the dam broke anyway. A sob escaped his throat, shaking through him before he could swallow it. The betrayal burned, not in the loud, angry way movies showed, but in a quieter, deeper way, like something old and sacred had been broken inside him. When the front door creaked open minutes later, he barely heard it. Emily stepped inside, freezing when she saw her father hunched forward, shoulders trembling. "Dad." He didn't lift his head. He simply handed her the phone with a shaking hand. "Listen," he whispered. Emily pressed play. It took exactly 4 seconds for her face to change, her expression sharpening with fury, disbelief, and a protective instinct she didn't bother hiding. When the recording ended, she stared at the phone as though it were something venomous. "They said this," she breathed. "They actually, Dad, this is abuse. This is manipulation. This is," she cut herself off, exhaling sharply to steady her voice. "We're sending this to Price, right now." Walter nodded, wiping his face. I didn't want to believe they meant all this. I didn't want to think Kyle." Emily knelt in front of him and took his hands. "Dad, look at me. This isn't your fault. People like Brittany manipulate, they twist people, but this," she lifted the phone, "this is their truth, not yours." She forwarded the recording to Price with a short message, urgent, evidence attached. 5 minutes later, Price called back. His voice, usually composed, carried a thread of unmistakable triumph. "Walter, Emily, this recording is gold, absolute gold. This proves intent. It proves Brittany's manipulation. And most importantly, it shows the court exactly who's lying." Walter exhaled shakily. Hearing someone else confirm what he'd spent months doubting felt like a pressure valve releasing. Price continued, "We'll submit this strategically. Not too early, we want maximum impact. But trust me, this changes everything." Walter ended the call slowly, staring at the phone resting in his palm. For the first time since the lawsuit began, the humiliation didn't crush him. It fueled something steadier, something stronger. He wasn't just hurt now. He wasn't just confused. He was determined. He straightened in his chair, wiping the last of his tears. The betrayal still ached, deep and raw, but beneath it, resolve took root, quiet but unshakable. Emily squeezed his hand. "You okay?" Walter nodded, voice low but certain. "No," he said honestly, "but I will be." Because now he had proof. Now he had truth. And now he had a reason to fight harder than he ever had before. He didn't know it yet, but this voicemail wouldn't just shift the courtroom. It would shift everything still to come. The courtroom air felt colder now, as if the walls themselves sensed the tension pulsing between the two tables at the front. Walter sat stiffly beside Attorney Price, his cane resting against his leg, his heart beating slower than usual but heavy. The earlier humiliation still lingered in him, but underneath it simmered a quiet resolve. He kept his eyes on the table, not daring to look at Kyle or Brittany. Not yet. Judge Marion Reed entered with her usual steady stride, but the atmosphere seemed to shift the moment she took her seat. She scanned the room, and her gaze paused on Walter for a heartbeat before shifting toward the plaintiff's table. Something in the way Kyle sat so casually, in the way Brittany dabbed her eyes with a tissue that didn't look remotely damp, made a faint crease form between Reed's brows. She sensed something, or rather, she sensed the performance already unfolding. "Plaintiffs, your opening statement," she said. Kyle rose with the exaggerated confidence of someone who believed the world owed him sympathy. He straightened his tie, glanced at Brittany as if for approval, and launched into a version of events so dramatic and exaggerated it barely resembled reality. "Your Honor," he began, voice trembling just enough to sound rehearsed, "my wife and I came to my father in good faith. We were excited about buying our first home. We were hopeful, and he promised to help us. Then he just turned his back on us, out of nowhere. It was like he didn't want us to succeed." Walter's jaw tightened. That wasn't just untrue, it was the opposite of everything he had ever done for his son. But he stayed still, stayed quiet. Price had warned him, respect wins even before evidence does. Kyle continued, layering on emotion like paint applied too thickly. "It's been devastating, not just emotionally, financially. We trusted him, and he abandoned us." Brittany sniffled theatrically right on cue. She pressed the tissue to her eyes, squeezing them dramatically to force out moisture that still didn't appear. "Your Honor," she said with a shaky voice, "I begged Walter to help us and he just shrugged. He said he didn't care. He left us struggling on purpose." Judge Reed's eyes sharpened, the faint irritation unmistakable. Something about Brittany's tone, the overly polished sorrow, the performative pain, registered as off. Reed tapped her pen once, slowly, signaling she was already cataloging inconsistencies. "Mr. Harris," Reed said, directing her attention to Kyle, "when why? Oh, say your father promised support. Do you have any written communication documenting this?" Kyle faltered for a fraction of a second, just enough for Reed to notice. No, it was verbal." "Convenient," Reed murmured under her breath, though loud enough for Price to catch the faint note of skepticism. Walter still didn't look up. He kept his hands folded in his lap, the picture of quiet dignity. He wasn't weak. He wasn't giving up. He was simply waiting for truth to do what truth always did. Brittany leaned forward again, her voice wobbling in a way that suddenly felt forced. "We were abandoned, Your Honor. My husband has been emotionally destroyed by this. Walter's cruelty blindsided us." Reed didn't respond immediately. Instead, she studied Brittany with a measured gaze, head slightly tilted. She'd seen real tears, real pain in her courtroom. What Brittany offered didn't quite land. At the defense table, Price rose slowly, smoothing the front of his suit. He offered a polite nod to Reed. "Your Honor, before we proceed further, I'd like to begin laying foundational context." Reed nodded. "Go ahead, Mr. Price." He stepped forward with the unhurried confidence of a man holding cards no one else at the table knew existed. "Mr. Harris," Price began, turning toward Walter but speaking loud enough for the entire courtroom. "In the time leading up to the alleged promise, what was your financial situation?" Walter lifted his head just enough to speak clearly. "I'm retired, fixed pension. I rely on my home and savings to get by." Price nodded. "Reasonable. And did you ever agree, verbally or otherwise, to provide financial support for the plaintiff's home purchase?" "No," Walter said simply. "I told them I couldn't." Reed scribbled a note, her expression thoughtful. Kyle and Brittany stiffened. Price turned to the judge. "Your Honor, transparency is important, and we intend to present thorough documentation. But for now, we want the court to understand that this isn't a case of broken promises. This is a case of conflicting stories, and the truth will become very clear." Reed leaned back slightly and gave a slow nod. "Mr. Price, I expect full transparency from both sides. No omissions, no dramatics, I want facts." Her gaze shifted pointedly to Kyle and Brittany. They both looked away. Something in the courtroom's balance shifted then. Not loudly, not obviously, but enough that even Walter could feel the subtle tilt. Price returned to his seat, leaning toward Walter. "The ground is changing," he whispered. "Stay steady." Walter nodded, the flicker of strength inside him growing quietly. And as Judge Reed prepared to call the next witness, the air tightened, because the truth was ready to push itself to the surface, whether Kyle and Brittany liked it or not. Kyle rose from his seat with the confidence of someone who believed every word he was about to say would be swallowed whole by the courtroom. He straightened his jacket, glanced once at Brittany, who gave him an encouraging, almost smug nod, and then faced Judge Reed with a posture that mimicked sincerity but carried none of its weight. "Your Honor," he began, "my father and I had a verbal contract. He agreed to help us with the down payment. He said he wanted to be part of our future, part of building something stable for us." He gestured broadly, painting himself as a man wronged. "We relied on his word. We trusted him." Walter felt the words hit like cold water down his back. A verbal contract. He had said the opposite. He had been as clear as an aging, heartbroken father could be. But Kyle's voice carried the easy rhythm of someone who had rehearsed the lie until he believed it. Brittany stood next, pressing her tissue to her eyes again, this time managing to squeeze out a single glistening tear. "Your Honor," she said, breath trembling just enough to seem practiced, "Walter begged us to let him help. He said he needed to feel useful. That helping us made him feel important. We didn't want to take advantage, but he insisted." Walter's mouth fell open slightly, a soft exhale escaping him before he could stop it. Begged. He had begged for peace, maybe, for understanding, but never had he begged to be used. Emily, seated quietly behind him, clenched her fists so tightly her knuckles blanched white. Walter didn't need to turn around to feel her anger radiating from the back row. She knew the truth. She had lived it. She had watched him struggle to say no to Kyle for years, watched him fold himself smaller and smaller to keep the peace. To hear the story twisted this violently made her jaw clench hard enough to ache. Judge Reed leaned forward slightly, resting her elbows on the bench. "Mrs. Harris," she said, her tone cool, "you're stating that Walter insisted on providing financial help." "Yes," Brittany said quickly. "He said it made him feel needed." Reed's eyes narrowed a fraction. "Earlier, you stated he refused to help and that his refusal devastated you. Now you're saying he insisted. Explain the shift." For the first time, Brittany faltered. Her lips parted, then closed. She blinked rapidly. "Well, I mean, he offered at first, but then he changed his mind." "So you're saying his position changed?" Reed pressed, her tone neutral but sharp. "Yes, exactly." "And at which point did you begin relying on this supposed verbal agreement?" Brittany hesitated again, searching for footing that wasn't there. We just trusted him." Reed's expression didn't move, but the energy in the room shifted. A thread of doubt, quiet but unmistakable, curled through the air. Price said nothing. He sat back, hands folded neatly, observing with a stillness that hid his readiness. Every inconsistency, every stumble, every overplayed tear, it was all material, ammunition, and he recorded each moment behind an unreadable expression that contrasted sharply with the unraveling performance across the aisle. Walter kept his gaze low, though he forced himself to listen. It was surreal, hearing his own life described by people who had twisted it beyond recognition. He heard Kyle say things that made him sound selfish, controlling, indifferent to their future. He heard Brittany describe him as a man desperate for attention, a fragile relic who clung to relevance by dangling promises he never intended to keep. None of it was true. But the worst part wasn't the lies. It was the realization forming slowly, painfully, like an unwelcome truth rising through mud. Kyle didn't see him as a father. Not as a man. Not as someone who had spent years sacrificing quietly, without complaint. He saw him as leverage. A means to an end. A tool to be used until it broke. Walter's heart tightened, not in anger at first but in grief, the kind that hollowed rather than burned. Price finally leaned toward him and whispered, "Let them talk. They're unraveling. The judge sees more than they think." Walter nodded faintly, but inside something shifted, a deep, slow recognition. He had spent years hoping Kyle would understand his limitations, his love, his efforts. But now he understood. Kyle had only ever measured worth in what Walter could give. Judge Reed turned a page on her ledger. "We'll continue," she said, her tone firmer now, "but I expect clear, consistent testimony from here on out." Her eyes lingered on Brittany. A small, unmistakable warning. Walter exhaled, steadying himself as the next question formed on Reed's lips, knowing this was far from over, and that the storm rising would expose even more than the lies already spilling into the room. Price rose from his seat with a deliberate calm, carrying a thick binder Walter hadn't seen him prepare. He placed it on the evidence table with a soft thud that seemed to echo through the courtroom. Opposing counsel looked uncertain. Brittany stiffened. Kyle shifted in his chair as if something cold had just slipped down his spine. "Your Honor," Price said, adjusting his glasses, "the defense would like to submit documented financial history between Mr. Harris and the plaintiffs. These include receipts, check stubs, electronic transfers, and supplemental support payments made over the past several years." Judge Reed leaned forward with visible interest. "Proceed." Price opened the binder and began laying out documents one by one. Each page was a quiet revelation. Rent checks Walter had written when Kyle was between jobs, receipts for car repairs Walter had covered entirely, bank transfers made in small but consistent amounts over the years. It wasn't a one-time act of generosity. It was a pattern, a history, a story told in numbers. Walter watched silently as pieces of his private sacrifices, moments he'd never boasted about, never even mentioned, were displayed for the court. He felt exposed but not ashamed. This was truth, a truth he had lived quietly and given freely. Reed lifted a page, adjusting her glasses to read more closely. Her eyebrows rose slowly, almost inch by inch, as she moved through the documents. "Mr. Price," she said, "am I reading this correctly? These payments span nearly a decade." "That is correct, Your Honor." "And the total amount?" she asked. Price flipped to a summary sheet and slid it forward. "Approximately $34,000, give or take, depending on unreported cash exchanges." A low murmur rippled through the courtroom. Kyle's face drained of color. His earlier confidence, the practiced indignation, the righteous posture, began cracking like thin ice under weight. He avoided looking at the documents, at the judge, at Walter. Brittany, on the other hand, leaned toward him sharply, whispering something through clenched teeth. Her eyes flashed with anger, not sorrow, not surprise, anger. Walter didn't need to hear the words to know the tone. Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you prepare me for this? Reed placed the papers down slowly, her expression shifting into something cooler, more discerning. She turned her attention fully to Kyle. "Mr. Harris," she said, her voice level but cutting, "why did you not disclose to the court that your father had previously provided substantial financial support to you and your wife?" Kyle swallowed hard. I didn't think it was relevant." Reed's eyes narrowed. "Not relevant." She tapped the binder once with her nail. "A decade of consistent support is extremely relevant if you are claiming abandonment and financial sabotage." Kyle opened his mouth, but no words came out. He glanced at Brittany, searching for guidance, but Brittany looked furious, her jaw clenched so tightly it trembled. Finally, Kyle stammered, I guess it just slipped my mind." Before Reed could respond, Brittany surged in, unable to restrain herself. "Your Honor, this is being framed unfairly. Those payments were nothing compared to what he promised us. They were just temporary support, small favors. This doesn't change the fact." Reed raised a hand, stopping her mid-sentence. "Mrs. Harris, I did not ask you. I asked your husband." Her tone was sharp enough to silence half the room. Brittany's eyes widened, then narrowed. She sank back into her seat, lips pressed tightly together. Kyle sat frozen, shrinking under the weight of his own unraveling story. Price stood still, hands folded neatly in front of him, his expression unreadable but undeniably confident. He didn't interrupt. He didn't push. He simply let the truth do the work. And it was working, every second shifting the courtroom's balance, every page exposing cracks in the narrative Kyle and Brittany had presented so confidently. Walter glanced at Price, who gave the faintest nod, a silent "we're exactly where we need to be." Reed looked over the binder once more, then exhaled slowly. "The court will consider this evidence carefully. It raises significant questions regarding the credibility of the plaintiff's claims." Brittany shot Kyle another furious whisper, one sharp enough that even the bailiff looked over. Kyle hunched his shoulders, avoiding her gaze, his composure slipping with each passing moment. Price stepped back to the defense table and calmly took his seat, leaning slightly toward Walter. His voice was a low murmur, controlled and steady. "The momentum is shifting. They weren't prepared for any of this." Walter didn't speak. He didn't need to. The truth was rising, finally rising, after being buried under accusations and manipulation. And as Reed turned the page, preparing her next question, Walter felt a rare and cautious hope stirring in his chest. The tide had begun to turn. Price rose slowly, smoothing the sleeves of his suit jacket with the same controlled precision he used for every move in this courtroom. Judge Reed, already unsettled by the inconsistencies in Kyle and Brittany's testimonies, lifted her eyes toward him with a quiet expectation. "Your Honor," Price said, voice steady but carrying a weight that made the room still, "the defense wishes to submit an additional piece of evidence, audio." Brittany's reaction was instantaneous. Her back stiffened, her face drained of color so quickly it looked almost theatrical, except this time it wasn't an act. Her eyes darted toward Kyle, wide and sharp with fear. Walter watched the panic bloom across her features, and though he didn't fully understand it yet, his stomach tightened at the sight. Judge Reed nodded. "Proceed." Price pulled a small device from his briefcase, the phone containing the voicemail Emily had forwarded. He handled it gently, like it was delicate, though everyone in the room felt the danger radiating from that tiny piece of plastic and circuitry. Brittany inhaled sharply, too sharply. "Your Honor," she began, voice rising, I object." "You don't know what's on this recording yet, Mrs. Harris," Reed said, tone crisp. "Sit down." Brittany sat, but her hands trembled violently in her lap. Kyle leaned toward her, whispering something frantic and low, but she shook her head, eyes locked on the device like it was a bomb about to go off. Price pressed play. At first there was only static, soft, crackling, harmless. But then Brittany's voice cut through it, sharp and unmistakable. "Oh my God," the recording began, dripping with contempt. "Did you hear him today? He sounded desperate, pathetic. Honestly, I'm shocked the old man can even walk into court without falling apart." A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. A bailiff shifted uncomfortably. Someone in the back muttered, "Wow." Walter sat completely still. The words he'd already heard in the quiet of his home echoed now in a public space, louder, harsher, more humiliating than before. But this time, they weren't breaking him. This time, they were exposing her. Kyle's voice came next, a short, dismissive laugh. Yeah, I know." Then Brittany again, sharper, crueler. "He's basically a walking wallet, Kyle. He always has been. He exists to be used. And trust me, the judge is going to eat our story up. He's clueless, gullible, and too soft to defend himself." Again the courtroom reacted, shocked murmurs, heads turning, eyes widening. Judge Reed didn't move. She didn't blink. She went stone still, stone-faced, her expression unreadable but unmistakably dangerous. The audio continued. "We're going to win this," Brittany said with smug confidence, her voice crackling through the speaker like poison. "Watch." Then silence. The kind of silence that feels alive, heavy, unbreathing. Price stopped the recording, letting the quiet stretch just long enough for the weight of it to settle fully. Kyle buried his face in his hands, his shoulders collapsing inward. Brittany, however, sat rigid, her chest rising and falling too quickly, eyes blazing with fear and fury, caught in her own voice, her own words, her own contempt. Judge Reed finally spoke, her tone controlled but sharp as a blade. "Mrs. Harris," she said, "would you like to explain this recording?" Brittany opened her mouth, but nothing came out. She looked cornered in a way that had nothing to do with acting and everything to do with undeniable truth. When she finally managed sound, it was a strangled whisper. That was taken out of context. "Context?" Reed repeated, lifting one eyebrow. "Please, enlighten the court on what context makes walking wallet. We're going to fool the judge, and he exists to be used acceptable statements." Brittany's jaw moved, but her voice failed her again. Reed turned to Kyle instead. "Mr. Harris." Kyle didn't look up. His fingers were tangled in his hair, his breath uneven, shame radiating from him in waves. He shook his head slowly, whether in defeat or confusion was impossible to tell. Walter felt his own breath steady for the first time all day. He hadn't needed to speak, not a single word. The truth had spoken for him. The recording had stripped away every lie, every manipulation, every false narrative Kyle and Brittany had tried to spin. It was all there now, exposed in front of strangers and professionals and the judge who would decide everything. Reed leaned back in her chair, hands folded, her expression returning to that cool, authoritative stillness that preceded judgment. "This," she said, "casts significant doubt on your credibility as plaintiffs, and it suggests a deliberate attempt to mislead the court." The blow landed harder than any gavel. Brittany's breath hitched, panic fully taking over now. But Kyle didn't move, didn't speak, didn't even lift his face from his hands. Price returned to his seat, his expression calm but carrying the faintest edge of satisfaction. He leaned toward Walter and murmured, "You did nothing wrong. They did this to themselves." Walter didn't reply. He simply stared ahead, stunned, hollowed out but steadied by the truth now laid bare. The voices that had mocked him in private had now become the voices that protected him in public. And as Judge Reed prepared to speak again, the room held its breath, waiting for the consequences of the recording that had silenced them all. Judge Reed sat frozen for a long, heavy moment after the recording ended, her expression carved in disbelief and tightening composure. The courtroom felt like it had stopped breathing. Even the faint hum of the lights overhead seemed muted. Then Reed slowly removed her glasses, folded them neatly, and set them on the bench with deliberate precision. Mrs. Harris, she said finally, her tone level but carrying a dangerous undercurrent of controlled outrage. The court requires an explanation. Brittany swallowed hard, her throat visibly bobbing. She forced her posture straight, wiped under her eyes in a poor attempt at appearing wounded, and spoke with shaky breath. Your Honor, that voicemail, it wasn't meant to be cruel. I was under a lot of stress. You have no idea what we've been dealing with. She gestured helplessly at Kyle. We're struggling. Emotions have been high. I said things I didn't mean. Reed's eyebrows rose slowly, almost imperceptibly, but her silence after Brittany's excuse was louder than any reprimand. When she finally spoke, her voice was even colder. Stress, she said, does not excuse calculated deceit. Brittany's mouth opened again, ready to fire back, but Reed cut her off with a raised hand so sharp that Brittany flinched. Kyle sank further into his chair, rubbing his temples, trying to disappear into himself. Both parties, Reed announced, her tone leaving zero room for argument, approached the bench. The bailiff called them forward. The courtroom murmured with anticipation as Price, Walter, Kyle, and Brittany walked to the front. When they reached the bench, Reed flicked off her microphone. Her voice dropped, low and fierce, meant only for the four of them. This, she said, tapping the bench with a finger, is a court of law, not a stage, not a place to manipulate, mislead, or mock the judicial process. I will not tolerate being deceived. Brittany stiffened. Kyle stared downward. Reed's gaze drilled into Kyle first. Mr. Harris, your testimony this morning contradicted multiple pieces of documented evidence, including your own voice in that recording. If I determine that you knowingly provided false statements, you may face perjury charges. That is not a hypothetical. That is a direct consequence. Kyle's breath caught, eyes widening with something close to terror. I didn't mean, I was confused. Confusion, Reed snapped quietly, does not explain fabrication. Brittany opened her mouth again, voice pitched high with indignation. Your Honor, we deserve a recess. We need time to regroup. This is blindsiding us. You can't expect us to respond to all this without. Denied. Reed's answer fell like a gavel strike. This court will not be paused to accommodate manipulation. We proceed. Brittany's face twisted, panic and anger warring across her features. Kyle looked like he might faint. Price stood calmly beside Walter, posture steady, expression unreadable but unmistakably prepared. When Reed nodded at him to continue, he reached into his briefcase again. Your Honor, he said, there is an additional piece of evidence the defense intends to submit, a second recording. Brittany whipped her head toward him, eyes blazing with panic. No, absolutely not. Kyle made this recording 2 weeks before today's hearing, Price stated, ignoring her entirely. It contains statements from Mrs. Harris regarding Mr. Harris's financial accounts, incorrect statements presented as fact, with the clear intent to justify their claims. Reed's expression hardened. Play it. The courtroom fell silent again as Price connected the device to the speaker. A moment later, Brittany's voice filled the room for a second time, but this time it carried a different flavor, cold strategy, not mocking cruelty. He has way more money than he pretends. Old people always hide money. We just have to make the judge see he's lying about being broke. Once they think he's hiding assets, the court will side with us. Then Kyle's voice hesitant, but what if he fights back? He won't, Brittany said confidently. He's weak. He hates conflict. We just need to push him hard enough. The court will believe us before it believes him. The audio cut out. Walter stood frozen. He had expected cruelty. He had expected mockery. But this was calculated manipulation, a blueprint for betrayal spoken with confidence and entitlement. A few people in the gallery gasped. Someone whispered, unbelievable. Reed's expression didn't change at first. Then slowly, very slowly, she leaned forward. Mrs. Harris, she said, her voice a low, dangerous calm, You fabricated financial assumptions, attempted to manipulate this court, and expressed clear intent to deceive. This is no longer simply a civil dispute. Brittany's face crumpled. Kyle looked nauseous. Reed turned to the clerk. Prepare a directive for immediate fraud review. I want a full audit of the plaintiff's claims, statements, and financial records submitted to this court. The clerk nodded quickly, already writing. The bailiff straightened, sensing the shift. Brittany's voice cracked open with desperation. Your Honor, this is being twisted. I didn't mean. Reed lifted a hand. Silence fell instantly. You will speak when spoken to, Mrs. Harris, and you will refrain from further dishonesty in this courtroom. Brittany closed her mouth, trembling. Reed glanced from Kyle to Brittany and back again, her eyes cold with disappointment and professional fury. This case, she said, has taken a significant turn. Walter stood quietly, absorbing everything with a mix of grief and gratitude. He hadn't wanted to win like this, through exposure of their darkest intentions, but he also knew the truth had finally risen above the lies. And as Reed prepared to announce the next steps, the air in the courtroom vibrated with a sense of irreversible consequences, because nothing about this case would ever be the same again. The courtroom felt different now, strained, brittle, as though one more lie might cause the entire structure to crack down the middle. The fraud review order still hung in the air like smoke, and neither Kyle nor Brittany seemed able to breathe properly beneath it. Brittany sat rigid, eyes darting, fingers twisting her tissue into shredded curls. Kyle stared at the floor, shoulders hunched, the weight of consequences finally pressing into him. Judge Reed folded her hands, looking at the pair with a calm that was anything but gentle. Mr. Harris, she said, I suggest you begin telling the truth. Your credibility is diminishing by the second. Kyle opened his mouth, closed it, then opened it again. His voice came out thin, trembling. Your Honor, I didn't want to do this. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Brittany's head snapped toward him, eyes widening with horror. Kyle, she hissed, don't you dare. But it was too late. Something inside him had cracked and the pieces were spilling out. Kyle's voice trembled harder. It wasn't my idea to sue my father. Brittany pushed me. She said it was the only way we'd ever get ahead financially. Brittany surged to her feet, face twisted with fury. You weak idiot, she exploded. You were in on all of this. Don't you put this on me. The room erupted in gasps. Even the bailiff stepped forward instinctively. Judge Reed slammed her gavel once, hard enough to echo across the entire chamber. Order, she shouted. Sit down, Mrs. Harris, or I will have you removed from this courtroom. Brittany froze mid-breath, her glare slicing through Kyle before she slowly lowered herself back into her seat. But the damage was already spreading, her mask cracking open for everyone to see. Kyle wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, shaking his head as though trying to steady himself. She told me Dad would never fight back, he whispered, voice raw. She said he owed us, that if we pushed hard enough he'd break. She said he was useless unless we made him give something. Walter felt the words hit him with a dull, familiar ache like bruises laid on top of older bruises. Kyle's voice wasn't cruel now. It was hollow, remorse leaking through cracks that had been sealed for years. But the confession didn't soften the pain. It sharpened it. Judge Reed's stare burned into Brittany. Is that true, Mrs. Harris? Brittany scoffed, but her bravado had wilted. Of course not. Kyle is lying because he's afraid. He's trying to save himself. Kyle shook his head violently. You told me Dad was an easy target. You said he was too old to understand what was happening. You told me. Enough, Brittany screamed, voice echoing. You always break down when pressure hits. You're pathetic, Kyle. Another gavel strike. Mrs. Harris, Reed warned, one more outburst and you will be escorted out. Silence fell again, thick and ringing. Price stood now, stepping forward with that same quiet confidence that had carried him through the entire case. Your Honor, he said, the defense has additional material relevant to the motives behind this lawsuit. He lifted a stack of printed screenshots, text messages Emily had helped chronicle from Kyle's old exchanges and Brittany's messages to mutual acquaintances. He approached the bench and handed them to Reed. These messages, Price said, show a clear pattern of manipulation, coercion, and strategic planning by Mrs. Harris. They include statements indicating her intention to use Mr. Harris as a financial lifeline, portray him as negligent, and pressure Mr. Harris in ways directly tied to the themes we've seen today. Reed scanned the pages, her eyes narrowing. These are explicit, very explicit. The courtroom held its breath. One text read, "Kyle will fold if I push him hard enough. His dad always bails him out." Another, "Old people panic when threatened. We just need a solid story." And another, "If the lawsuit scares him, he'll settle, free money." Kyle stared at the floor, his shame almost visible in its weight. Brittany's face went pale with realization. The walls were closing in. The lies were dissolving faster than she could conjure new ones. Walter bowed his head, not in defeat, but in the overwhelming heaviness of truth finally surfacing. His heart ached for the son he'd loved, the one he'd tried to protect long after he should have set boundaries. Yet beneath that pain was something else, something steadier. Pride. Not in what Kyle had done, but in what Walter had done. In holding firm, in refusing to bend to manipulation, in finally standing up for himself even when it hurt. Price stepped back beside him and murmured, "This is the unraveling. We're nearing the end." Judge Reed placed the stack of texts aside, her expression steeled with purpose. "The court," she said, voice ringing with authority, "recognizes that significant deception has taken place. Legal consequences will follow, not just civil but potentially criminal." The room went silent. Brittany swallowed hard. Kyle's head dropped even lower. Walter lifted his eyes, feeling the shift, knowing the tide had finally turned. And as Reed prepared to move the hearing forward, the air buzzed with the weight of what came next, because the fall of their story was only the beginning of the reckoning still to come. Judge Marion Reed shifted in her seat, the leather of her chair creaking faintly as she straightened her posture. When she looked down at Kyle and Brittany, all warmth drained from her expression. The restraint she'd shown earlier was gone. In its place was a sharp, unwavering authority that filled the courtroom like a rising tide. "Mr. and Mrs. Harris," she began, her voice firm enough to still every whisper in the gallery, "this court is not a weapon, yet you have attempted to use it as one, against a man who has repeatedly supported you, financially and otherwise, for many years." Kyle's shoulders curled inward. Brittany stared straight ahead, jaw tense, eyes darting anywhere but toward the judge. Reed continued, "Your testimonies have contradicted documented evidence. Your claims have shifted depending on convenience. Your behavior shows a disturbing lack of respect for the truth and for this institution." Brittany let out a quiet, indignant huff. Reed heard it. She turned her gaze directly toward her. "Mrs. Harris, you initiated this lawsuit with a claim of financial abandonment. Yet the evidence presented today, including your own recorded words, suggests your motive had little to do with need and everything to do with manipulation." Brittany crossed her arms. "We were struggling." Reed cut her off sharply. "Do not lie to me again, Mrs. Harris." The words hit like a slap. The gallery froze. Brittany blinked hard, as if stunned that the judge had spoken so directly. Reed lifted a sheet of paper from her desk. "We subpoenaed preliminary financial records as part of your filing. According to your credit card and bank statements, you and your husband spent nearly $12,000 over the past 3 months on luxury items, designer clothing, high-end electronics, spa packages, vacations, all while claiming severe financial hardship." Brittany opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Kyle clasped his hands together, staring down at his thumbs, unable to look anywhere else. Price stood slowly beside Walter, sliding another set of documents forward. "Your Honor," he said calmly, "the defense also submits supplemental bank records showing discretionary spending that contradicts the plaintiff's narrative of financial desperation. These purchases were made while they were preparing to sue Mr. Harris." Reed accepted the documents, but she barely needed them. Her expression had already hardened into something unforgiving. "So you weren't seeking help," she said coldly. "You were seeking a shortcut, a payout, and you targeted someone you believed would be too kind, too fragile, or too old to defend himself." Walter felt the words sink into him with a strange mix of pain and validation. He gripped the edge of the table lightly, trying to keep his breath steady. He didn't want to cry, not here, not in front of the people who had broken him. But emotions welled inside him anyway, thick and tight near his throat. Reed wasn't finished. "You weaponized guilt. You twisted family ties into leverage. You attempted to undermine Mr. Harris's credibility with fabricated claims about his finances and intentions." She leaned forward, her voice dropping into a deeper, sharper register. "This isn't simply irresponsible. It is ethically reprehensible." Brittany's face twisted. "We were just trying to build a life." "Stop," Reed's voice cracked through the air like a whip. "You were trying to exploit someone who loved you. There is a difference." Kyle flinched. Reed turned her gaze to him. "Mr. Harris, your father supported you for years, far beyond what most parents could or would do, and you repaid him by standing beside a fraudulent claim meant to extract more from him. Do you understand the severity of what you've participated in?" Kyle swallowed hard. "Yes, Your Honor," he whispered, voice trembling. Brittany shot him a cutting glare, but Kyle didn't look back. His face was damp with embarrassment and shame. Walter felt his chest tighten again, not with grief this time, but with a complex ache, a mixture of heartbreak and relief. For so long, he had worried that maybe he had failed Kyle somehow, that maybe he hadn't been enough as a father. Hearing Judge Reed speak the truth aloud made something inside him loosen, finally. Reed took a breath, steadying herself before delivering the final blow. "This," she said, lifting her chin, "is not a family dispute. This is exploitation." The words echoed through the courtroom, heavy and final. Walter closed his eyes for a moment, overwhelmed. Emily reached forward from the row behind him, gently placing a hand on his shoulder. He held back tears by tightening his jaw, inhaling slowly through his nose. He had always feared that speaking up would make him seem ungrateful or cruel, but standing silent had invited a far deeper cruelty. Reed wasn't finished. "This court will be addressing the legal ramifications of your actions shortly," she told Kyle and Brittany. "But understand this. The damage you have done to your relationship with Mr. Harris may never be repairable, and that cost is far higher than anything you could have gained here." She paused, letting the weight settle. "Now," she said, turning the page on her docket, "we proceed." The tension in the room deepened again, because though the truth had finally surfaced, the reckoning was far from over. Price rose from the defense table with a measured confidence that made the entire courtroom lean in a little closer. He gathered a new stack of documents, thicker, heavier, and far more ominous than anything he had presented before. When he stepped toward the bench, even the bailiff straightened, sensing the turn coming. "Your Honor," Price said, his voice steady but carrying an unmistakable edge, "in light of the evidence presented today, both audio and written, the defense is filing a counterclaim against Kyle Harris and Brittany Harris." Brittany's head snapped toward him, eyes narrowing. Kyle blinked rapidly, as though he hadn't processed the words correctly. Price continued, laying the documents before Judge Reed. "The counterclaim includes 3 counts: harassment, attempted fraud against an elder, and intentional infliction of emotional distress." A heavy silence fell. Someone in the gallery inhaled sharply. Kyle leaned toward Brittany, whispering in a frantic, cracking voice, "This is going too far. This is Brit. What do we do?" But Brittany didn't whisper back. She sat stiffly upright, her posture snapping into a rigid line. Her voice came out sharp and venomous. "This is his fault," she spat quietly, nodding in Walter's direction. "He's doing this to us. He's selfish. He wants to ruin our lives." Walter felt those words slice into him, words spoken without a shred of remorse, even after all that had been exposed. His hands tightened around the edge of the table, knuckles whitening. How many years had he tried to win her approval? How many holidays had he walked on eggshells, hoping not to disrupt her expectations? And now, she still blamed him. Before he could lower his gaze, another voice rose, firm, emotional, and unshaken. "Emily." She stood from the gallery, shoulders squared. "No," she said, her voice ringing through the courtroom with a clarity that startled even herself. "My father didn't ruin your lives. He gave you everything he had, and you tried to break him for it." All eyes turned to her. Walter's heart ached at the sight of his daughter, protective, furious, trembling with the weight of what she'd held back for years. Brittany scoffed, ready to snap back, but Judge Reed raised a hand sharply. "Ms. Harris," Reed said, addressing Emily directly, "this is a courtroom, not a forum. I understand your emotions, but I must ask you to sit." Emily nodded, chest rising and falling, and slowly lowered herself back into her seat. But something subtle happened. Reed's eyes softened for the briefest moment, and she gave Emily a small, respectful nod. A silent acknowledgement, a recognition that Emily had spoken not out of chaos but out of truth. Price resumed the floor, lifting another stack of documents. "Your Honor, in support of the counterclaim, we are submitting written statements from multiple neighbors who witnessed interactions between the plaintiffs and Mr. Harris. These statements describe patterns of manipulation, coercion, and verbal disparagement directed at Mr. Harris over several years." Reed accepted the papers, flipping through the first few pages with an increasingly grim expression. "These neighbors observed such behavior firsthand?" she asked. "Yes, Your Honor," Price confirmed. "Several report hearing Brittany belittle Mr. Harris. One describes Kyle pressuring his father for money on multiple occasions. Another witnessed Brittany describing Walter as, quote, easy to squeeze." Brittany sputtered, "That's taken out of context." Reed glared. "Mrs. Harris, one more interruption and I will hold you in contempt." Brittany quieted instantly. Kyle slumped deeper, face pale, lips parted as though he might finally speak, but no words came. Panic had hollowed him out. Price stepped back to the defense table. "Your Honor, the defense asserts that this lawsuit was not initiated in good faith, but as a calculated effort to extort an elderly man who has consistently supported the plaintiffs financially and emotionally." Reed tapped her pen slowly against the bench. Each tap felt like a countdown. "The court," she said, her voice echoing across the room, "acknowledges the validity of the counterclaim. The plaintiffs will answer to these charges." Kyle let out a broken breath. Brittany stared straight ahead, her expression unreadable for the first time. No anger, no arrogance, just the faint trace of fear beneath a cracking facade. Walter felt something shift deep inside him. Not triumph, not vengeance, but a long overdue clarity. For years, he had lived under the weight of being taken advantage of, doubting himself, trying to be the parent Kyle needed even when Kyle no longer saw him as anything but a resource. But now the truth was no longer silent. The court heard him. The judge saw him. And Kyle and Brittany finally faced the consequences of the choices they'd made. Judge Reed closed the folder. "We will proceed to determine appropriate legal and financial penalties. Prepare yourselves." And with that, the tide didn't just shift. It turned fully in Walter's favor, sweeping away the last remnants of the story Kyle and Brittany tried to build on lies. Kyle sat hunched at the plaintiff's table, trembling beside Brittany as the weight of every lie, every manipulation, every recorded word, pressed down on him like a collapsing ceiling. His eyes were red-rimmed, unfocused, darting between the judge, the floor, and finally his father. Walter felt the stare before he saw it. Slowly, he lifted his gaze. The moment their eyes met, Kyle broke. A sound escaped him, half sob, half apology, before he buried his face in his hands. Shoulders shaking, he rose unsteadily from his chair. "Dad," he choked out, voice cracking. I'm so sorry. I'm sorry, Dad. I never should have done this. I never should have let it get this far." The courtroom fell silent. Even the air seemed to stop moving. Walter stared at his son, the same boy he used to carry on his shoulders at county fairs, the same teenager he helped through every failed job, every financial stumble. Seeing him crumble now didn't bring satisfaction. It brought something heavier, something mournful. Kyle stumbled forward a step, hands shaking uncontrollably. "Dad, I didn't want to sue you. Brittany pushed and pushed and said it was the only way. She said you'd cave if we scared you. I swear I didn't mean to hurt you." A tear hit the courtroom floor. Before Walter could respond, Brittany shot to her feet like she'd been burned. "Oh, grow up, Kyle," she snapped, voice slicing through the room. "You're crying because you got caught, not because you're sorry." Kyle recoiled, stunned. Brittany kept going, voice rising. "Pathetic. Absolutely pathetic. You think this little performance will save you. I married you because you had potential, because I thought you could become something. But look at you, you couldn't even stand up to your own father without collapsing." Gasps spread across the gallery. Even the bailiff took a step forward. Judge Reed slammed her gavel so sharply the sound cracked through the courtroom walls. "Mrs. Harris," she barked, "if you insult one more person in this courtroom, I will hold you in contempt and have you removed immediately. Do I make myself clear?" Brittany swallowed hard, but her glare remained fixed on Kyle, now more furious than defiant. Kyle wiped his face with shaking hands. His voice trembled as he spoke again, quieter but steadier. "It's always like this," he whispered. She talks to me like that all the time, for years. She tells me I'm nothing without her, that I owe her everything, that if I don't do what she wants, she'll leave." His admission cracked something open in the room. Brittany's face twisted, realization dawning that the man she had controlled for so long was finally slipping out of her grasp. Kyle exhaled shakily. "I know what I did was wrong, Dad. I knew even when we filed the suit. I knew it the second we signed the papers, but I didn't know how to stop it. She said I was weak. She said you'd never fight back. She said we deserved your money." He broke again, covering his face. "I'm sorry, Dad. I'm so damn sorry." Walter felt his chest ache, not with triumph, but with a grief so deep it almost felt familiar. A grief he had carried the day Kyle moved out under Brittany's influence. The day he stopped calling, the day the distance grew, until father and son felt like strangers separated by glass. He didn't stand. He didn't speak. He simply listened, because some truths needed space before they could be answered. Brittany took a step away from Kyle as if distancing herself from a sinking ship. Panic flickered in her eyes. "You're blaming me," she hissed. "After everything I did for us, for you, you think you can pin this on me just to look better for the judge." Kyle didn't respond. His silence was answer enough. Judge Reed took a slow breath, folding her hands with an air of finality. When she spoke, her voice was calm, authoritative, and absolutely immovable. "This court has heard enough," she said. "Given the plaintiff's misconduct, manipulation, and attempted fraud, I will be scheduling a formal sentencing hearing." Brittany's breath caught. Kyle went pale. Reed continued, "The consequences for your actions will be significant. This court does not tolerate the exploitation of an elder, nor the misuse of legal proceedings for personal gain." Walter stared down at his hands, absorbing the moment. He had not wanted this. He had not wanted punishment, nor exposure, nor victory. He had wanted family. He had wanted peace. But the path here had demanded truth, and truth had brought its own justice. Brittany looked around the room, realizing too late that Kyle was no longer standing by her side. Her gaze landed on him, incredulous. "You're abandoning me," she whispered, voice trembling for the first time. Kyle didn't answer, he couldn't. Reed tapped her docket. Court will reconvene after a short recess to set the exact date for sentencing. She struck her gavel. The sound rang through the courtroom like the final crack in a breaking foundation. And as everyone stood, the tension didn't dissolve, it tightened, stretching toward the moment that was now inevitable. Sentencing was coming, and nothing would be the same afterward. When court reconvened after the brief recess, the tension inside the room had deepened into something electric, something unstable, like the air before a thunderstorm breaks open. Walter sat quietly beside Price, his palms still cool from the shock of Kyle's breakdown. Emily slid into the seat behind him, her presence a steadying force. She squeezed his shoulder gently before settling, as if bracing for whatever came next. Price stood the moment Judge Reed returned to the bench. He didn't bother with his usual preamble. Instead, he lifted a thin folder Walter had never seen before, one sealed with a bright red tab. "Your Honor," he said, voice calm but carrying the unmistakable tone of a man about to drop something explosive. "The defense has uncovered an additional piece of evidence. It is highly significant and directly related to the plaintiff's intent." Brittany stiffened instantly. Her eyes narrowed to slits, scanning the folder like it was a weapon aimed straight at her. Reed adjusted her glasses. "Mr. Price, proceed." Price opened the folder slowly, deliberately. "This," he said, pulling out a printed document and holding it up for the court, "is an attempted asset transfer filed 6 weeks before this lawsuit, submitted by Mrs. Brittany Harris." A ripple of confusion passed through the gallery. Price continued, "It appears Mrs. Harris attempted to add Mr. Harris's name, without his consent, to a private debt consolidation loan totaling nearly $50,000. Gasps erupted across the courtroom. Walter blinked, stunned, his stomach twisted in sick disbelief. 50,000. In his name. Price handed the document to the bailiff, who delivered it to Judge Reed. Reed studied it closely, her eyes moving across the page, then flicking sharply toward Brittany. "Mrs. Harris," Reed said, voice dropping into a tone colder than anything she'd used so far, "are you aware this is a criminal offense?" Brittany shook her head violently. No, this is being twisted. That wasn't a real submission. It was a draft, nothing more. I never filed it." Price stepped forward. "Your Honor, the record shows the submission was processed, then flagged for verification when the lender attempted to contact Mr. Harris for confirmation. When they couldn't reach him, the application stalled, but Mrs. Harris absolutely filed it." The courtroom erupted again. Whispers, gasps, even a low whistle from someone in the back row. Reed's jaw tightened. This is a serious matter. Attempting to place someone's name on a loan without their knowledge is financial fraud. Kyle let out a broken, guttural sound and crumpled forward, face in his hands. He shook his head over and over. "Britt, what did you do?" His voice cracked, desperate. Why would you?" "For us, Kyle," Brittany shrieked. "For our future. You think your father was ever going to help you. You think he cared whether we made it or not. Someone had to take charge. Someone had to make the moves you were too weak to make." Reed slammed her gavel so hard the wooden block jumped. "Mrs. Harris, that is enough." But Brittany wasn't listening anymore. Panic had overtaken her. She spun toward the gallery as if searching for someone who might save her. "I'm being scapegoated," she shouted. "Everyone here wants to make me the villain when all I ever tried to do was help my family. Walter never cared. He never supported us. This whole court is against me." Her voice hitched, rising into a wild pitch. Emily stood instinctively, stepping closer to her father before the bailiff signaled her to remain behind the bar. She reached over the rail and took Walter's hand, grounding him as Brittany's unraveling grew louder. Walter felt his daughter's fingers tighten around his. For the first time that day, the warmth of her grip steadied the trembling in his chest. Brittany whirled toward Walter. "Say something," she screamed. "Tell them you're not the victim here, tell them." Price cut in, voice sharp. "Your Honor, the defense moves that the court immediately acknowledge fraudulent intent on the part of the plaintiffs and rule in favor of Mr. Harris." Reed didn't hesitate. Motion granted. The courtroom went dead silent. Reed lifted the fraudulent loan document again, almost in disbelief. Given this evidence, the plaintiff's credibility is not only destroyed, it is exposed as intentionally deceitful and malicious. Kyle's sobs grew louder. He sank lower, collapsing inward like a man whose spine had given out. Reed continued, "Mrs. Harris, your actions may constitute criminal fraud. Therefore, I am ordering a full investigation into your financial dealings related to Mr. Harris." Brittany looked like she had been punched. "No, no, you can't." Reed raised her voice. "I can and I will." Brittany staggered backward, gripping the edge of her table. Her breathing quickened, her bravado collapsing into raw fear. Kyle finally lifted his face, eyes swollen, broken. "You said we were just pushing Dad. You said it would be fine, you said." Brittany rounded on him, desperate. "Kyle, you're not going to let them do this to me. Tell them the loan was your idea. Tell them." But Kyle shook his head slowly, tears streaking down his cheeks. "I can't lie for you anymore." Reed rapped her gavel once. "The court hereby rules overwhelmingly in favor of Mr. Walter Harris. All claims against him are dismissed with prejudice." Walter closed his eyes. The words washed over him with a mixture of relief, sadness, and something like release. Reed wasn't finished. "A fraud inquiry into Mrs. Brittany Harris is now open. Court will reconvene for sentencing and further review." Emily squeezed Walter's hand harder, her voice soft but steady behind him. "It's over, Dad. It's finally over." But as Brittany let out a strangled, furious cry and Kyle crumbled into silent devastation, Walter knew one thing. The truth had landed. But the fallout had only begun. When the gavel struck for the final time that afternoon, Walter felt the sound resonate through his bones. Not like the sharp crack of judgment he'd dreaded for months, but like the snap of a chain finally breaking. As people began to rise from their seats, the courtroom blurred around him. His hands trembled when he reached for his cane, not from fear this time, but from the sudden release of tension he'd been carrying for far too long. He stepped out into the courthouse hallway, the fluorescent lights buzzing faintly above him. For a moment he simply stood there, breathing, letting the cool air settle in his lungs. "It's over," he told himself. "You're free." But after years of carrying the weight of Kyle and Brittany's expectations, their insults, their manipulations, freedom felt strange, like stepping into sunlight after months underground. Footsteps approached behind him, hesitant, unsteady. "Dad." Walter turned, already feeling his throat tighten. Kyle stood a few feet away, eyes swollen and red, embarrassment painted across his face. He looked nothing like the confident accuser who'd walked into court earlier. He looked like a boy again, lost, wounded, and unsure of whether he was allowed to step closer. I'm so sorry," Kyle whispered, voice cracking. "I never meant, I didn't think she'd take things this far. I thought I had to choose between her and you." Walter swallowed, the ache sharp. He opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. What did a father say in a moment like this? What words could carry both forgiveness and hurt, both history and hope? Kyle stepped closer, tears spilling. "I'm sorry, Dad, I'm sorry for everything." His voice collapsed into a sob. "I don't expect you to forgive me, I just needed to say it." Walter felt Emily's presence beside him, her fingers brushing his arm gently as if asking, "Do you want to? Can you?" He took a slow breath. "Kyle," he said softly, the name heavy with decades of love and disappointment, "I'm glad you told the truth today." Kyle nodded, weeping harder. But Walter added, voice steady even as emotion tugged at it, I need time. Kyle's face crumpled, but he nodded again, accepting the boundaries Walter had spent a lifetime avoiding. Before either of them could speak again, a sharp clacking of heels echoed down the hallway. Brittany stormed past them, sunglasses hiding nothing, her mouth twisted in rage. People turned as she passed, recognizing her, whispering, staring at the woman whose confident smirk had shattered in front of a judge. She didn't look at Kyle. She didn't look at Walter. She simply pushed through the glass doors and into the parking lot, walking fast, as if running from a fire she had started herself. Walter watched her go, a strange mix of sorrow and relief washing over him. She had controlled the narrative for so long, every holiday, every family conversation, every tension-filled moment. Now all that power had evaporated in a single afternoon. Price walked up moments later, carrying his folders tucked beneath one arm. His expression remained professional, but the slightest hint of satisfaction flickered behind his glasses. Mr. Harris, he said, given the court's findings, you have every right to pursue damages. Fraud, emotional distress, legal fees. There is a strong basis for financial compensation. In cases like this, judges often rule generously. Walter shook his head before Price even finished. No, he said quietly. I don't want any more fighting. No more courtrooms, no more battles. I just want peace. Price nodded as if he'd expected this answer. Then consider the matter closed. He extended his hand. You stood your ground, Mr. Harris. Not many people could have done what you did today. Walter clasped his hand, gratitude warming his chest. Thank you, Vincent, truly. Emily touched her father's arm. Dad, she murmured, let's get out of here. You need a break. Yes, he whispered, I think I do. She guided him outside, away from the courthouse steps where years of emotional exhaustion finally felt like they were lifting off his shoulders. They walked to her car, the cold evening settling around them, but for the first time in a long while it didn't feel biting. It felt clarifying. Emily drove them to a quiet little diner on the edge of town, a place Walter hadn't visited since before his wife passed. The windows glowed warm against the darkening sky. Inside, the booths were half empty, the smell of fresh coffee drifting through the air. Emily chose a corner booth away from the few other patrons, giving her father space to br. Eve. Walter stirred his coffee slowly, watching the spoon circle through the dark liquid. I don't know how I let it go on this long, he said softly. I kept giving, thinking it would fix things, thinking it would show Kyle I loved him, but all I did was make myself smaller. Emily reached across the table and held his hand. Dad, you gave because that's who you are. Mom loved that about you. I love that about you. But giving to the wrong people doesn't make you weak. It just means they didn't deserve it. Walter's eyes stung. I always thought if I said no, I'd lose him. And if you kept saying yes, Emily said gently, you'd lose yourself. He nodded slowly. She was right. And for the first time, he understood something he had avoided admitting for years. Protecting himself didn't mean abandoning his son. It meant setting boundaries that should have existed long before today. He exhaled, a long, heavy breath he felt all the way down to his bones. I'm done letting people take pieces of me, he said finally. It's time I learn how to keep some things for myself. Emily's smile was soft, proud. That's a good start, Dad. Outside the diner window, snow began to fall, light, slow flakes drifting quietly from a sky finally ready to settle. And as Walter watched them, sipping his coffee with steadier hands, he realized something. For the first time in decades, his life belonged to him again. And tomorrow, he would begin rebuilding what remained. The next morning, Walter woke to a stillness he hadn't felt in years, a quiet that wasn't heavy or suffocating but gentle, honest. His home felt different, as if the walls themselves sensed something had shifted inside him. For the first time in a long while, he didn't wake with dread sitting on his chest. He lay there for a moment, staring at the ceiling, letting the weight of the previous day settle into place. Justice had been served. He had survived something he once believed would break him. And now it was time to rebuild. The first step came easily: security, emotional and physical. Walter walked through the house with new purpose, gathering old spare keys from drawers, checking every door, window, and lock. He called a locksmith and watched from the entryway as new, stronger locks were installed, each metallic click sounding like a small reclaiming of power. By noon, he stood in his living room holding his phone. His thumb hovered over Kyle's name, then Brittany's. He took a deep breath and hit the button he should have pressed years ago: block. Their numbers vanished from his screen, and with them, the invisible tether that had kept him living in fear of their next demand, their next insult, their next crisis. He added a few extra protections too: a call screen, a spam filter, even a password on his voicemail. Every step felt like a stitch, repairing a tear inside him. Emily arrived with a cardboard box under one arm and determination under the other. She stepped inside, smiling gently, ready to tackle some memories. Walter nodded, though the thought tightened his throat. They went to the back room, the one he had avoided since his wife passed. Dust motes floated in the light, settling on boxes that hadn't been touched in years. Emily opened the first one carefully. Inside were old photo albums, birthday cards, school drawings Kyle and Emily had made decades ago. Walter ran his fingers over the edges of the memories, each one sparking warmth and ache at the same time. "Dad," Emily said softly, "you don't have to keep everything, only what lifts you, not what weighs you down." He nodded. Some boxes they kept. Others they closed gently and carried to the trunk of Emily's car for donation. But the hardest ones contained reminders of the years after his wife's death, years when Walter had tried too hard to fill two roles at once, years when he mistook sacrifice for love and silence for peace. When they finished, Walter sank onto the couch, exhausted but lighter. "Thank you," he said. "I should have done this a long time ago." "You weren't ready then," Emily said. "You're ready now." The next step was one Walter had resisted for years. He needed someone to talk to, someone outside the family, outside the history. Emily helped him find a therapist, a calm, seasoned man with a quiet voice and eyes that listened even when his mouth didn't speak. Walter sat across from him in a room painted soft earth tones, feeling awkward at first, like a man showing a stranger the inside of his pockets. But slowly the words came. He talked about his wife, the laughter they shared, the way she used to tap his shoulder twice when she wanted him to look at her, how losing her felt like losing the map to his own life. He talked about Kyle, his boy who struggled so much, who he tried to help until helping became enabling. He spoke of Brittany, how her presence had slowly drained the air from holiday dinners, how her voice could slice peace into ribbons. And he talked about himself, the loneliness, the guilt, the fear of confrontation, the belief that saying no made him a bad father. The therapist listened, nodding, sometimes asking questions that dug deeper than Walter expected. Questions that made him see patterns he hadn't named before. Patterns that made him realize he wasn't weak. He had been grieving. He had been trying. He had been alone and doing the best he could. Week by week, session by session, something in him straightened. His voice steadied. His breath deepened. His shoulders lifted. And slowly, almost quietly, confidence returned. One afternoon, Walter found himself sitting on his porch as the sun dipped behind the Colorado trees. The breeze was crisp, carrying the smell of pine and winter. For once, the sight didn't make him feel alone. It made him feel rooted. Neighbors stopped by over the next few days, one by one. Mr. Thompson from 2 houses down brought fresh rolls. Linda from across the street hugged him, telling him she had been praying for him. A younger couple he barely knew told him they admired how bravely he stood up for himself in court. "You set an example," Linda said, squeezing his hand. "Not everyone your age would have fought back, but you did." Walter felt heat gather behind his eyes, not from pain this time, but from something close to pride. That evening, when the house settled into its familiar quiet, Walter walked through it slowly, touching the walls, the furniture, the edges of framed photographs. The shadows no longer felt threatening. The silence no longer echoed with footsteps of people who took without giving. For the first time in years, Walter felt safe in his own home. Truly safe. He sat in his recliner, exhaled deeply, and let the stillness wrap around him, not as a burden but as a beginning. Tomorrow, he thought, he would keep rebuilding. Tomorrow, he would learn what life felt like without fear. And for the first time in a long time, tomorrow didn't scare him at all. The letter arrived on a gray Tuesday morning, slipped through the mail slot with the soft drag of paper against metal. Walter didn't recognize the handwriting at first, hesitant, uneven, as though every word had been written, paused over and rewritten. He stood in the entryway for a long moment, staring at his son's name in the upper corner. Kyle Harris. Seeing it there, quiet, inked, vulnerable, tightened something in his chest. He carried the envelope to the kitchen table, sat down slowly, and ran a thumb along the flap before opening it. The paper inside was thick, the kind people used for apologies or condolences. Walter unfolded it carefully. "Dad," the letter began, "I don't expect you to forgive me. I'm writing because I need to tell the truth, not the kind Brittany pushed me to say, but the kind I should have spoken years ago." Walter's breath caught. He continued reading. "I was weak. I let myself be shaped by someone who didn't care about you or about me. I believed her when she said you held me back. I believed her when she said I deserved more from you. I was ashamed of every mistake I made in my own life, and instead of facing that shame, I let her convince me it was your fault." The words blurred slightly as Walter blinked, steadying himself. "I know I hurt you. I know I betrayed you. And I know the damage might be too deep to undo. But I need you to hear me when I say, I'm sorry, truly. I'm sorry for choosing the wrong person to trust. I'm sorry for not protecting you the way you always protected me." By the time he reached the last lines, Walter's hands trembled. "If you ever want to talk, I'll be here. If you don't, I'll understand. I'm trying to get help. I'm trying to fix myself. Kyle." Walter leaned back in his chair, the letter resting in his lap. Emotion folded over him in slow, layered waves, not just sadness, not just relief, but a tender ache that felt both old and new. He loved his son. That had never changed. But love didn't erase what had happened. It didn't erase courtrooms, lies, or the echo of Brittany's voice dripping poison through his life. Emily walked in moments later carrying a bag of groceries. She saw the letter on the table and paused. "Is that from him?" she asked gently. Walter nodded. "Do you want me to read it?" He handed it to her. She scanned the pages silently, her jaw tightening as she took in each sentence. When she finished, she set it down carefully, as though the words were fragile. "Dad," she said softly, sitting beside him, "this is a good first step for him. But that's all it is, a step. You don't have to rush back into anything." Walter sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "He sounds sincere." "He might be," Emily admitted. "And that's good, but sincerity doesn't mean he's changed. Not yet. You deserve to be careful this time." Her words settled over him with a strange comfort. She wasn't pushing him toward or away from Kyle, she was protecting him, giving him space to choose without guilt. After a long silence, Walter nodded. "You're right. I need to go slow." That afternoon, he sat at his writing desk, the one his wife used to write holiday cards from, and pulled out a blank sheet of paper. He stared at it for several minutes before the pen finally moved. "Kyle," he wrote, "thank you for your letter. I hear the sincerity in your words. I appreciate the courage it took to write them. I'm not ready to talk about forgiveness yet, but I am willing to have a conversation, one step at a time." His hand hesitated, then continued. "I'm glad you're getting help. Keep going. If you want us to talk, let's do it when your counselor thinks you're ready. Healing is possible, but it needs honesty from both of us." He signed his name simply. Dad. Walter read the letter twice before sealing it. It wasn't reconciliation, not yet, but it was a door cracked open, not closed. 3 days later, Kyle responded with a brief message. My counselor says starting slowly is good. I'm committed. Thank you for giving me a chance. Walter read the note, exhaling a breath that trembled with something unfamiliar, something cautious, tender, and undeniably hopeful. He wasn't ready to rebuild everything. But maybe the foundation wasn't gone after all. And as he folded the letter and set it in his desk drawer, Walter realized hope didn't have to be loud or sudden. Sometimes it appeared like this, quiet, cautious, a small light in a long, dark hallway. The knock on the front door came just after 6, soft, uncertain, nothing like the impatient rapping Walter had grown used to when Kyle and Brittany used to show up unannounced. Walter wiped his hands on a dish towel, took a breath to quiet the flutter of nerves, and opened the door. Kyle stood there alone. No Brittany. No tension radiating from behind him. Just Kyle, shoulders slumped, hands shoved deep into his jacket pockets, eyes carrying a weight Walter hadn't seen in years. Hey, Dad, he murmured, voice low. Walter stepped aside. Come in. Kyle obeyed quietly, almost gratefully. As he stepped into the familiar living room, his gaze drifted across the space, at the framed pictures, the worn recliner, the subtle changes Walter had made recently. His expression softened, almost nostalgic. You changed the locks, Kyle said, not accusing, just observing. Walter nodded. I needed a fresh start. Kyle lowered his eyes. I get that. They moved to the kitchen, where a simple dinner waited: roast chicken, potatoes, green beans. Walter hadn't planned anything extravagant. He wasn't sure how the evening would go. Kyle sat down gingerly, like a man entering a room he no longer felt entitled to occupy. For a moment neither spoke. The silence was thick but not hostile, just fragile, like thin ice stretching across cold water. Finally, Kyle cleared his throat. Thank you for letting me come tonight. Walter nodded. Your letter meant a lot. Kyle swallowed, his eyes glistening. I meant every word. Walter waited. He wanted the apology spoken, not just implied. Kyle seemed to understand. He placed his hands flat on the table and inhaled shakily. Dad, I'm sorry for everything. His voice cracked, but he pushed on. I'm sorry I let Brittany talk me into things. I'm sorry I didn't protect you. I'm sorry I made you feel like you were worthless. His breath trembled. I knew deep down it wasn't true, but I was ashamed of myself, and it was easier to blame you than face who I'd become. Walter felt the words settle into him with both sadness and relief. He reached for his water glass, giving himself a moment before responding. I forgive you, Kyle. The words came softly but firmly, real, not rushed. Kyle exhaled sharply, as if he'd been holding his breath for months. But Walter continued, forgiveness doesn't mean going back to how things were. We're rebuilding, slowly, with boundaries. Kyle nodded instantly. I know, I don't expect anything else. They began eating, the silence now gentler, punctuated by sips of water, small nods, and the quiet sounds of plates shifting. After a while, Kyle spoke again, voice almost childlike. Do you remember when we used to come here after Mom died? He asked. You'd make grilled cheese for dinner, and we'd watch old cartoons because none of us knew how to talk about anything. Walter smiled faintly. I remember, we were all trying to survive back then. Kyle nodded. I didn't know how hard you were trying. I thought you were supposed to be stronger than loss. I didn't understand you were grieving too. Walter's heart tightened. I should have talked to you more. I thought protecting you meant staying quiet. Sometimes silence hurt more, Kyle said gently. The honesty stung, but it was necessary, like cleaning a wound before it could heal. Just then the front door opened softly. Knock, knock, Emily called, stepping inside. I brought dessert. Thought maybe we could all owe. She paused when she saw the warmth in the room. I hope I'm not interrupting. Kyle stood quickly. No, please. Stay. His tone was humble, sincere. Nothing like the dismissive attitude he once gave his sister. Emily smiled, surprised but relieved. She set a pie on the counter and joined them at the table. The three of them ate in a rhythm that felt oddly natural, sharing stories, revisiting memories, even laughing quietly at a few old mishaps. For the first time in years, the conversation wasn't strained. No bitterness, no undercurrents, just family, tentative, healing, imperfect but trying. At one point, Walter leaned back slightly, watching his children talk. Emily teased Kyle gently. Kyle rolled his eyes but smiled, a real smile, small and tired but genuine. The sound of their voices blended into something faintly familiar, something he thought he'd lost forever. A warmth spread through Walter's chest. Something inside him, something long bruised and quietly waiting, finally eased. Not everything was healed, not everything was fixed, but something had shifted. Something had begun. And as the evening drew on, with dessert shared and soft conversation lingering in the air, Walter felt, for the first time in a long, painful stretch of years, a fragile, cautious, beautiful sense of hope. The courthouse looked smaller now. Walter stood on the steps months after the storm had passed, a man delivering nothing more dramatic than a stack of final paperwork, closure, stamped and notarized, resting in a manila envelope tucked beneath his arm. The winter air brushed against his face, cool and clean, carrying the faint scent of pine drifting down from the mountains. Snow shimmered on the grass below, untouched, like a new beginning waiting for footprints. He paused before descending the steps, turning once to look at the tall doors behind him, the same doors he had walked through trembling, frail, uncertain. Today he stood straighter. Today his cane was a tool, not a burden. Today he didn't feel small. Inside those doors, months earlier, Judge Marion Reed had watched his broken family unravel. She had cut through lies with precision. She had given truth a voice when Walter couldn't find his own, and he remembered her words as clearly as if she stood beside him now. A father is not a bank. A father is a human being with dignity. He hadn't realized, before she said it aloud, how deeply he needed someone to speak those words into the world. Into him. They landed like a lifeline, something firm he could hold as he pulled himself out of years of manipulation and guilt. Those words had changed him. He had replayed them in his mind through quiet mornings and restless nights, through therapy sessions and small victories. He let them settle into old wounds until they felt like truth instead of permission, until he believed he deserved respect, until he believed he deserved boundaries. Boundaries, something he'd once feared would push his son away, had become the bridge that allowed a new beginning. Kyle was trying, slowly, haltingly, but sincerely. Counseling had softened the rigidity in his voice. The shame that once closed him off now opened him up. He visited Walter every week, not asking for money, not demanding anything, just showing up with coffee or a story or a memory from childhood that still made them both smile. He worked part-time jobs he used to think were beneath him, building a foundation instead of leaning on someone else's. He apologized often, not in desperation but in recognition, in growth. Walter didn't need the repeated apologies. Seeing the change was enough. Brittany, on the other hand, had vanished from their lives entirely. After the fraud inquiry, after the sentencing, after Kyle walked away from her control, she disappeared from the town altogether. Her absence wasn't something Walter celebrated. It was simply quiet, a noise gone from the background, a door finally shut. Walter breathed in slowly, letting the cold air fill his lungs. He felt lighter today, lighter than he had in decades. It wasn't because everything was perfect now. It was because, for the first time in his life, he wasn't carrying everyone else's weight on his shoulders. The burden of fixing his son's life wasn't his anymore. The burden of enduring disrespect was gone. The burden of being silent to keep peace, he had laid that down too. Emily's car waited at the bottom of the steps, steam curling from the exhaust into the winter air. She waved through the windshield, her smile warm. She had stood by him through all of it, the pain, the betrayal, the rebuilding. She was the reason he didn't fall apart. She was the reminder that not all family wounds, some heal. Walter adjusted the envelope under his arm and began walking down the steps, his cane tapping steadily beside him. Each step felt like part of a rhythm, one that belonged to him again. His life was quieter now, smaller in some ways but richer in the ways that mattered. When he reached the car, he paused again, glancing once more at the courthouse behind him, where lies had been spoken, where truth had risen, where a father regained himself. He spoke softly, not to the building, but to the memory of who he had been inside it. "They rolled their eyes at me," he said, a small, knowing smile forming, "but the truth made them bow." And with that, Walter Harris stepped into the winter sunlight and into the rest of his life.